transition lead pastor here at Soul Covenant Church. And it's my privilege to introduce to you our speaker for the morning. I wish I could say he's a friend but I can't, because we've done like 3 things together in our lives. But I know this: we have a mutual respect for each other. How God has touched our lives. He's a layman, just like the rest of you. And I am in awe of this guy because of how God has touched his life, what God is doing through his life. I invited him to come and to share some of those stories, hopefully to be an inspiration to you that what God has done in his life can happen in your life. Janver, Holly, come on up and share with us.
Well, thanks, Randy, for that. But it's very generous and gracious. He let the cat out of the bag, though. He said a little while ago, he told me as we were walking that there are some good candidates for a permanent pastor. And he thought it would be a good idea if the speakers weren't very good for a while. That way you'll really take to the new guy. So then he calls me, and so I'm that choice today. So expect terrible, and it's going to get worse. Yeah. So most of the time, people have a question about my name, Janver. Where in the world did that come from? And it's been mispronounced my entire life. So I thought I would try and build a couple of bridges with all of you, some commonalities. So I actually was born very close to Randy. Randy was born in Kalinga. I was born south of Fresno into a Mennonite community. And I could trace my Mennonite roots back 10 generations, believe it or not. We have all this stuff, and it's a bunch of stuff. That's all it is. It's a bunch of stuff. So I grew up at 4 years old, and here's where I was hoping to build a little link with some of you. I had my own cow at 4 years old, and I was milking by hand every morning and every night at 4. No kidding, it's a true story. And I would get in so much trouble for not stripping a cow clean, and most of you probably don't even know what that is, but a cow will dry up if you don't get all the milk out every time. And so I was the oldest of 5 kids, and so at 4 I had my own. Well, my parents, it was the 60s, everything's in revolution. My parents decided to escape the reservation, which they did, and moved to this urbane community called Watsonville. Some of you have been there? So I was raised in Watsonville, and my dad was an activist, picket line marching, active in all this stuff. He owned half the herd in Dinuba, gave that up, and he was a math teacher, and he taught math. So we got to Watsonville, and Dad did, like I said, picket line marching, true believer, leftist extremist, and still proud of that to this day at 88. And so he said, I'm not going to live in town of Watsonville, that's too urban. So we're going to live out in the fields. And so I was raised in the fields of East Watsonville, and my graduating class was 76% Hispanic, 12% white, and 10% Asian. So I grew up in the middle of that. We had to pick berries and tomatoes and everything else. I pruned apples during the winter. I just wanted to build bridges with this place because that's kind of what happens around here, right? You're ag all the way through. So that was my point. But actually what I'm here to talk about is to help you understand a roadmap of how to damage your own life, how to bring some chaos into your life. I'm kind of a specialist at that. How to disappoint and discourage people. I don't know if any of you can relate to that. Nothing there. How to argue with God for a number of years and then eventually lose that argument. Some of you may have been there too. Essentially, how to walk away from God, how to put myself first over everyone else, and just create chaos. Well, I was at lunch with Randy a couple of months ago, and some great things have happened. I've been a builder my whole career. I just sold a mid-size construction company to a couple of principals. They took it over with commercial and public works and stuff. And so my wife and I plan to retire early. And we've had a home in Lake Oswego, Oregon for 10 years, and our 2 oldest sons live up there, and we're just like, we're ready to go. And along the way, this kid who's 34 now, he was in my driveway one day, and he's a pest applicator, and I start talking to him. His name's Bobby Ramirez. So Bobby and I are talking, and I've had a chance along the way to help build a bunch of construction companies around the country, actually, small companies, and bring them up to mid-size. And it's part of the group that was doing this on a nonprofit basis. And Bobby's talking about how he wants to get his own pest company. He's about 26 at this point. And so Bobby and I are having this conversation. I say, well, let's get together for coffee. And so we get together for coffee, and about the third or fourth thing, I'm talking about his dreams and visions and how he'd like to put it together and this kind of thing. And this has been my practice as a Jesus follower, especially for the last 15 years. About the third or fourth conversation or coffee or whatever we're having, say, hey, what's this matter to you? Why does this matter? What's in it for you? And then he tells me, and then it's my turn. Well, I'm a Jesus guy. And as Bobby tells it in retrospect, his eyes roll back in his head, and he goes, oh, no, not one of these nutcases. And as you can tell, I can exude nutcase sometimes. So, but after a while, just hanging out together, talking business, talking strategy on how to get started. Bobby's got absent parents, lived in an apartment his whole life, second generation, and that's like my hometown, Watsonville. Man, these are my people. And so Bobby, though, eventually, after a couple years, he comes to Jesus. And he starts walking with Jesus, and he brings a friend of his, Aran Mendoza. And so Aran and we start talking, and Aran wants to start an HVAC company. And then another thing happened, and pretty soon we've got a group of guys, mostly second generation guys, some first, almost all Hispanic. And I'm right in my element from Watsonville days. But and so in the meantime, Bobby says, hey, my wife and I are ready to leave. He says, you got to come and visit my church. And because for whatever reason, the church I was going to, Randy left a stamp on that church. This was where we met, and it wasn't for him. So that was kind of what happened there. But Bobby said, you got to come and check this out. So I go one day, and my wife looks at me after the end of the church. She goes, I feel right at home here. And we put off retirement, and we invested ourselves into that different church for the last 18 months. And during that time, and I'll talk about it a little bit, but different people we've just had opportunities with people left and right and men, and I personally have been able to lead a dozen guys to Jesus in the last 18 months. And it is the most exciting thing in the world, being part of what God is doing in unexpected ways at unexpected times. One of the other things that happened is this thing called Life Rock. Now, Life Rock, a few years ago, was just minding my own business, and my pastor came up to me and said, hey, I know part of what I've done is construction, but also kind of a developer, and we own and operate apartment buildings and so on. He said, look, I know you do housing, and this guy is running a sober living house. And it's a sober living house, and he's losing it. Well, I do legal and financial work behind the scenes on projects and stuff, and so he said, I think you guys should meet. And so this was 9 years ago. So I meet with this guy, and it turns out what he's really looking for is kind of a sugar daddy, and I don't want any part of that. But I did say, look, you're coming to this church, why don't we do something nonprofit where we can actually bring people forward to Jesus? And so in this sober living house, it was being foreclosed on, and so we were able to find some of my other partners. We looked around, we found a 10-bedroom house. We said, let's do this. Let's take this, and you don't have to believe anything to belong, to be in recovery, but let's open this house. And we made this other guy the director, and we set up the whole legit nonprofit thing behind. It's called Life Rock. And so we opened this house. And then 18 months later, we opened another house. And so now we have 36 guys in the house. And then we opened a women's house and found a women's director. And then another women's house, and then a house for women with children. And so now we have 85 beds that are full. And out of that, we have a lot of people who aren't seeking Jesus. But because of that, we have 3 paid directors, and we had to part company with our original director. But we have 3 paid directors who have all come through the front door. And we have another 15 managers who have each committed their life to following Jesus. Now, some of those people are returning to faith, but many are brand new to faith, and they're following Jesus today because it happens to be that as we are intimate with Jesus and as we are listening and we're being prompted by the Spirit and he's making changes and doing things, he's orchestrating all of this stuff behind the scenes. But the great thing is I get to lead this group of leaders or a group of managers every week. So it's a discipleship meeting. It's a how to lead people meeting. It's people who are fresh out of the crisis of addiction of one kind or another. Now, I talk to them frequently about the gift of addiction, or a gift of recovery, rather. And the gift of recovery is that unlike a lot of the rest of us, you have a chance in recovery. In order to be in recovery, you have to look yourself square in the face and say, look, I have really messed this up. I mean, my life is in chaos. My life is just not operating the way I want it to. I'm not getting the results I want, and it's just not going well. And I have to recognize that, and I tell my folks that I get to spend time with regularly, this is a gift, because so many people sleepwalk their way through life and never get that their life is actually in chaos. So we look at that. Well, this is actually a sermon, and Randy said, hey, you got to bring some message, so here it is. 100 years ago, I took a class on speaking, and I learned that every speech or sermon has 3 good points. Any more than that, and look out. Things are going to go off the tracks, and it's going to be terrible. So here you go. Here's your 3 points. All right, some of you are still awake. Thank you. Yeah. But I want you to get this, who we are. And this arise out of chaos comes here. Since then you've been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. A lot of this stuff we're really familiar with, right? We know that Jesus died. We know that Jesus was raised. We have all these facts assembled in us here, that we've been raised with Christ, that Jesus went to the cross for us, and now our identity is in Jesus. And if I ask just about any of you if that's true, you say, yes, I know this. I know this is true. I know that God has come for me, and I know that Jesus loves me, and not just the world in general, but me, and that I'm identified with Jesus in his death and in his resurrection. He calls us friends. We are his people. I want to talk for just a moment about emotional and spiritual health. Now, Dr. Peter Attia, I don't know if you've heard his name. He's just written this runaway bestseller called Outlive. Stanford MD, surgical resident at Johns Hopkins, and then he worked for the NIH for 5 years, and then he turned 37 after all that, and had 2 kids. Underachiever. Yeah. And so he writes this book about the science and art of longevity. It just released, and I hope you get it. It's great, but here's a spoiler alert. The number one way to live a longer life is to, what would you guess? Keep running. Exercise, at least 3 hours a week. So there you go, you don't have to buy the book. But one of the things he does talk about, and he's got this fascinating thing, because he talks about emotional and mental health as a component of a long life. And he breaks us down as a society into these categories. People who have what goes wrong in longevity. And he's more fascinated not with the actual number of years that you live, but he's fascinated with the useful and thriving section of your life. So most of us aren't really sentient before age 5, in my case, 15. And there's an end of life period where people struggle. And so he's mostly interested in maximizing this piece. But he says, in his work, and he's done he did a meta study with NIH over a period of time, analyzing all these studies that are out there, and he found that there's a group of people here who are so at the end of their emotional and spiritual health that they commit suicide. And those numbers are at an all-time high today in this country. But then there's the next group up, and these are what he calls the parasuicides, and that's actually a term in the literature, parasuicide. And we see the tip of that iceberg in the homeless population. People who have just stopped caring about themselves. They don't take care of themselves anymore. They don't take care of their emotional needs or their spiritual needs or the people around them. They are just committed parasuicide. They haven't taken their life, but they've given up their life. The next group up from the bottom is actually the largest group in our society. It makes up the bulk of our society, and it's the next group up. And he calls it this: these are the people who are just merely miserable. Just miserable. And this is the largest segment of our society. And he goes, I can tell you how to live longer as a medical doctor. I can help you extend your life, but what's the point? What's the point of avoiding dying when we haven't yet figured out how to live? Boy, that struck me. What is the point? Well, I had an existential life crisis. I had to wrestle with God and decide who was going to be in charge. And it kind of looked like this. I was kind of doing my stuff. I came to Jesus when I was at the end of, when I was 17, the end of my junior year. I was all in for Jesus. I went to the junior college, set up a book table, talked to everybody I could, went to a Biola in Southern California, got a degree in Bible, did my Greek and all this stuff, was a youth pastor for some years. Always had to work as a builder in order to pay the bills because Dad was a math teacher who was kind of absent. And so his contribution to me was to help me buy an old truck so I could work. So, okay, fair enough. So I worked. So then I was a youth pastor, kept on working. And so then I decided to go to seminary, and I did. I completed a master's degree in theology, and I just kept on building and building. Then I completed a master's in divinity degree, kept on building. Felt like, God, you just want me to keep on working, which is okay. I'll reach those people who are working, who are workers. And I got to speak at your sister church in Santa Rosa probably 100 times some years ago over a period of 7 or 8 years. I filled in for John Strong for a long time when he was gone. And then at the end of that, I realized, you know what? I was working at the Rescue Mission. I was chairman of the board of directors there for a decade. God, I'm doing all this stuff, but you've given me this wife that I just can't stand. And I don't like her, and she doesn't like me, and we've been married 23 years, 24 years. God, why would you do this? And you won't change her. And I prayed about it, and I started rebelling. Can you imagine that? Praying about your spouse and they don't change? I don't know if you've ever experienced that. Yeah, I know. Randy said try and build some, commonality, and none of you have experienced that. So there we go. So I got sick of it, and I started arguing with God, and I made some bad decisions that got worse. I lost my marriage through my own bad decisions. I lost my business. It had at that time about 20 plus employees. I lost my reputation in the community. I lost my internal sense of integrity. I lost most of my friends in the divorce. Since we had 2 nickels to fight over, I personally wrote the Attorney's Full Employment Act and stayed in litigation for 7 years with my ex-wife. Lost my properties that I'd acquired. My financial future was gone. I spent 5 years arguing with God. My life was in chaos. Ever been there? Ever made some decisions that were so stupid that you just can't believe that it was you, but it is you all the way through? Your life is in chaos. Well, Paul talks about, in this same passage, 1970 years ago, approximately, Paul writes this passage to the Corinthians. His antidote to chaos in your life, his antidote to problems in your life, his antidote to you feeling like you can't even see a way forward in your life is to start with your why. And guess what? Dr. Peter Attia, who we talked about a second ago, he decided to come up with the same idea, and he said, hey, I'm a revolutionary, cutting-edge researcher. It's important to start with your why. Paul said it a little while ago. And for me, I had to sit finally after 5 years and say, God, this is terrible. I haven't been walking intimately with you. I was doing a lot of stuff before, but I wasn't really with you. We were left here to know God. We were left here to walk intimately with God, to be his hands and feet in carrying love to other people in the place of intimacy and power, not as a doer to try and impress or to perform or to do because it makes you look good or to show up at church just because you should. That's not the plan. And I had my why. I had to get it straightened out. I was a follower of Jesus. No question about that. But I ended my 5-year argument humbling myself and saying, God, what do you have? I don't have anything. I have messed up everything. I have nothing. Well, I got remarried. And we started attending a small Presbyterian church. And this is where I met Randy a few years ago. And I sat there for 2 years saying, God, I have messed up everything. How could you possibly ever use me? How could you do anything with this mess of a person? And it turns out that God is actually the God of chaos. It turns out that God actually takes that humbled spirit, which, I was pretty arrogant before. I'd made a couple nickels, I'd acquired some things, I was serving here and I was serving there, and I looked pretty good on paper. But at the end of this 5 years, I looked like nothing on paper. So we start here with Paul's antidote to chaos. Since you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. But I had been focusing on something else. Verse 5 in that same chapter, chapter 3, he says, put to death whatever's of your earthly self, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Why? Why does he say that? Our culture thinks it's because God's a killjoy of some kind. But the reality is Paul is saying to us, take your feet off the ground or your eyes off the ground. You're shuffling around looking at the dirt. You're all about your own desires and your own stuff and all of that. Lose it. Get your why is in heaven. Set your minds on things above where Jesus is. So before I met Randy, I started focusing on intimacy. I just started focusing on being with the Lord. And I sat there for about 20 minutes a day. I was in my office by 6 every morning, so I'd get up at 4:30, I'd exercise for 20 minutes, and just sit with God for 20 minutes. I've got 2 graduate degrees in theology. I don't need to learn anything, but what I needed to learn was to sit with God and enjoy God. So I started doing that. And that's when Randy showed up. I was actually back on the board of elders by then. This is like 8 years has gone by. And I'm back on the board of elders serving. The pastor in the church wouldn't leave me alone and just kind of kept on me. And then Randy shows up for a little bit. And now he paid me money to burnish his halo this morning. So I took that money and I've got it. I'm running right after the service. But what I learned from Randy in this point is Randy showed me a way toward intimacy. He doesn't even know he did that. He doesn't remember it. But through some conversations we had, he was only there, 8 weeks maybe you were there. And but there were some other breakfasts we had with a small group of us. And what we got in that time I got a sense of a practice and a habit of walking with God that took me to places I had never known before. It took me from my 20 minutes to an hour to 3 hours a day that I now, since I'm sold my main company now, so I have a little more time, but just to sit with God and say, God, what do you have today? So I learned intimacy on steroids and began to search and add, and Lord, what do you have in this? And learn to just sit quietly and learn to say, Spirit of God, move through me. And as I kept on meeting with guys and taking more and more time over the last 10 years or so, 12 years, to meet with guys and share Jesus with these guys and just say, to walk into every situation, Lord, would you coordinate this? Would you organize this? And pray through these things. Well, I lost my marriage through my own bad decision. And during this time, God restored it. So that's my family. That's my United Nations family there. My daughter-in-law, Chinese, stepson that I raised is Sicilian, and Big Puffy, that's me, and my wife, and my daughter-in-law, who's obviously black, and my 2 tall, whiter than me son, and my Mexican stepson, and his wife, who's now pregnant, and my daughter and her wife. They don't all walk with Jesus. 4 of us out of that group do. But I pray for them, and they are my family, and God has restored this family, a family that I never even imagined before, who are beyond blessing. I lost my business. It's now 5 times what it was then when I sold it. I lost my reputation in the community. Well, Santa Rosa is kind of a small town, and my ex-wife talked a lot, and that's what happened. So I lost my reputation. That's tough, but guess what? I don't have any more fake image. I'm just Janver. I survived a crisis. And it turns out a lot of people have survived crises. And they're more willing to talk to somebody who they know is not that honorable than they are to somebody they've got on a pedestal. So God has blessed that. He took that and he took my internal sense of integrity that I used to have and self-arrogance and all this. I humbly just live in Jesus today. I lost most of my friends in the divorce. And I kind of don't want them back. It's the truth. I lost all of our properties, our investment properties we had. I kept one, but God has, that side of the business is now almost exactly 70 times the size that it was then. And it's just laying decision after decision in front of God. What do you want? And it's come down to this. This whole thing that we call this little group of mostly Hispanic guys, not all, back porch meets at my house once a week. That's turned into this whole thing that's, we see men and women coming to Jesus week in and week out. We're doing about, at our church now, it's gone from 70 to 700 in the last 3 years. And we're seeing somebody baptized almost every week. So whatever's gone on here, I'm just going to say to you all, and especially you who are in leadership, God can rebuild in a spectacular way what we don't expect. He can take crisis and put something that you never even imagined before. And so when I talk about intimacy, I'm just going to wrap up with this. When I talk about intimacy with God, here's what it looks like. It's not just acquiring knowledge. Now, I do read the word during my time, but I sit and I say, God, what do you have? What, by your Spirit right now, and I have a window, I can kind of look out over Santa Rosa, and I pray for the town, and I pray for people, and I pray through my calendar, and I say, God, would you supernaturally come and insert yourself into that conversation? Would you do that, please? Lord, I need you now more than ever. Lord, would you do this in this conversation? I get to meet with this guy. Is this his day to come to you, Lord? And I'm asking the question as I drive to meet, as I sit down, Lord, what do you have? Insert yourself. Would you do this thing? Lord, we have this business decision to make. Lord, would you insert yourself? Because I want that intimacy. I cannot live without that intimacy. That's what Randy introduced me to in a way that I hadn't understood before. But it wasn't that Randy's halo is so brightly shining. It's the way the kingdom works. God sent Randy through me. And some of these guys that I've helped either start businesses or invest in them one way or another, and these guys, we now have a group of 50 men at our church who, I went to the pastor last year and said, I can't keep up. Too many guys are coming to Jesus. And I can't keep up. I can't keep track. Guys are falling in the cracks. And he said, he's an old Campus Crusade guy. He goes, hey, let's just start discipleship. Let's do it. Let's ask for commitments. Let's drive it deep. Let's take these guys and let's see what happens. So I've got 5 guys that other guys coming to Christ, but I got 5 guys. There are 50 in this program. We found some other guys who could step up. And sitting at my kitchen table at 5 a.m. before they go to work on Tuesday mornings, the guys have committed themselves. The oldest one is 3 years old in Jesus, and he came to Christ when he was stabbed 10 times. Then he came to Christ. Similar stories all the way around the table. Guys who are late 30s, early 40s, young families, just coming to Jesus. Coming to Jesus. One of the most exciting things to me and unexpected, I thought I could pray before. But it turns out that in this process of humbling myself, prayer has taken on an entirely different thing. In the process of sitting with God and asking him through specific things, I want to just give you very quickly, and Randy said when the red light starts flashing in the back, that means go faster. So here's what you get. You know, you always try and beat the red light, right? Just almost, yeah. So here's what prayer started to look like, and I'm just going to tell you about this week. And this is not because of me, it's because of what God is doing. So Tuesday morning, and some people in my church, they know that I pray, and I'm up early and I pray. And so there are some other young guys now who join me, even though we're not together, they join me in prayer. So I get a text at 7 o'clock in the morning. And this Quinn is this lady's name, and she contacted somebody who's in the church office who knows me, And Quinn is our violin player. She plays in the band, and we've got a big band, and it's a great band. But she plays violin, and she's so versatile. She goes along with whatever song and just adds to it. She plays the Santa Rosa Symphony. She's from China. She's been trying to get her aging parents, who are mid-80s, to the U.S. because they're getting old, and she wants to take care of them. Took a long time to get their visas. They showed up 2 weeks ago. In a week, her dad gets sick. He wasn't sick before. They probably wouldn't have let him in. But in a week, okay, that's the real. You got to shut up and stop now. Sorry, man, I'm going to tell a story about Jesus. I don't care. Yeah. So at 7, this comes to the church office lady. She sends me a text. She sends the prayer team a text, which I'm part of that too. And she goes, would you pray? This guy has just been put on hospice. And he's not a follower of Jesus. And Quinn is just asking for a prayer that he comes to Jesus. So we start praying. At 9 o'clock, I got a text. This man in his 80s has just received Jesus. Got it for Jesus. So I know, it's amazing. So then what happened? So I did the numbers a little bit. This guy's probably lived 30,000 days. Say, take away 5,000 days when he wasn't sentient. And he wasn't hearing about Jesus most of his life in China, although it turns out that maybe he had attended a house church a couple times. So anyway, I thought the odds of him coming to Jesus on that day that a bunch of us started praying are about 1 in 25,000. So yeah, you can write it off and say, oh yeah, well, that happened. You got here. Things changed. Maybe. So on Wednesday, or Thursday and Friday, we put together this little leadership conference called Global Leadership Summit, and a bunch of these young guys that I'm helping get started in business stuff. There are 20 of us there. And it's a live feed from Chicago, and it's going out around the world. And all of a sudden, and we've invited a bunch of guys who are not Jesus followers yet. So we're just asking, we're going on, we're in the first hour, and it's a whole series of speakers, and we've done it before, not at this location, and we brought it in, and all of a sudden, the feed goes dead. And there's about 6 or 7 minutes, and, everybody's cool for a second, but all of a sudden, the tone starts to change, and I don't know what was the matter with me. I said, Janver, why aren't you praying? Just goes through my head, because I've been praying through this whole thing. And so the words were not out of my mind, but I said, Lord, would you? The feed comes back up at that moment. And didn't go back off the rest of the day. And it had already gone out about 4 or 5 times, but it didn't go back out the rest of the day because there were guys there who needed to hear about Jesus. This is the daily experience of intimacy with God. Every appointment, every day. I'll tell you this last story. So last year, our church is growing fast, not believers primarily. And lots of opportunities to share Jesus. Last year, we decided to take, the pastor decided to take a group to camp. So we got 200 kids, or 185 kids, to go to camp last year. So my role in camp, we put it on ourselves, and my role was to wash dishes. So I ran the Hobart SS 300. That's 300 baskets per hour, baby. 185 kids, 70 adults. That's a lot of dishes. But I also got to pray. So as soon as we finished washing dishes, the kitchen staff would go sit in the back of the chapel and pray, and pray, and pray. And in the middle of these meetings for these 4 days that we were there wasn't any big fizz at the end. There wasn't a big fire with throwing pine cones in and keep people committing their life to Jesus. The guy just preached from the story of Lazarus. And at the end it said, if you want to receive Jesus, stand up. 100 kids stood up in Santa Rosa. 100. That was last year. This year, there were another 185 kids, some of the same, but out of those 100 kids, not all of them stuck. The parable of 4 soils still applies. So this year we prayed differently, said, Lord, would you do this thing? Would you bring some studies out of this? Would you bring alive kids who can walk with you in their campuses? We had a murder on our campus that's next to our church, just like a lot of campuses, and things are just falling apart. Lord, would you do this thing? So we prayed for groups to come out of this, people to continue on in faith and to be part of what's going on. And this last week, and out of that, one of my buddies, Adon Mendoza, who came to Christ, I mentioned him a little bit earlier. So he's in this cabin, and he brings all these guys together, and they on their own say, you know what, guys? A couple of us were here last year, and this really didn't stick. Man, we got to get together. We got to study. We got to be in the Word of God. And the first on-campus meeting took place last Friday, and we were praying that day for that to happen. Because time after time after time, during that same camp, one of the guys who came to Christ last August, he says he's a MMA fighter. This is not exactly the polished kind of guy. He's tattooed up to here. His name is Gabe Dulce or Pacheco. He goes by both. But he's all in for Jesus, and he's learning and learning and learning. So I see him the first night. I knew he was coming, and I'm in the back praying, and he's got 17 eighth graders. Spastics, right? But he sees me, and he comes over and he gives me a big hug, and he starts weeping. He goes, Janver, just pray. I just want to see these kids come to Jesus. I just want to see it happen. And he's leading these kids to Jesus by the end of the week. Just in answer, we're just praying, God, would you do this thing? There is a future here, folks. And as you invest yourself in intimacy with God, your future is here, watching God work. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, we are also revealed with him. And our why is this. Here's how to do it. Set your minds on things above, not here on earthly things. Set your hearts on things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on what God has for you to do and ask him, what do you have? For my life is hidden with Christ in the Father, who has called us to be his partners, to be intimate with him, to be empowered by him, to be loved by him today. Let's pray. Father, we give you glory. You sent your son, Jesus. You have loved me. You've loved the entire world for Jesus, yes, but Lord, you came for me. And you've designed me to be who you have to reach people. Lord, I just pray for this group of people right here, that in every heart, maybe the sin is just sitting around and doing nothing for 10 years. Maybe it's pornography, maybe it's sexual stuff, maybe it's whatever. Lord, you've called us out of chaos to yourself. Lord, I just pray for each one here. Please, Lord, right now, in this moment, let every person grab onto you, say, Lord, whatever I've got, whatever it is, take me. I want you, Lord. I want nothing but you. We give you glory in Jesus' name. Amen.